Prairie Mosaic is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008, the North Dakota Council on the Arts, and by the members of Prairie Public.
Welcome to Prairie Mosaic, a patchwork of stories about the people and places that contribute to the arts, culture, and history in our region.
Hi, I'm Bob Danback.
And I'm Barb Gravel. On this edition of Prairie Mosaic, we'll listen to a world-renowned classical guitarist, learn about the empire builder, and hear a musical story of a Dakota Indian from the mid-1800s.
One of the more impressive museums you'll find in Minnesota sits just outside the town of Onemia. It's the Mille Lacs Indian Museum, a facility housing artifacts and historical items chronicling the history of the Mille Lacs tribe in central Minnesota.
The Mille Lacs Indian Museum started out as a trading post, and the trading post is still an active trading post. We buy and sell and trade items with American Indians. Sell a lot of handmade items made from traditional materials and pretty much using a lot of the traditional methods that have been handed down from generation to generation. Today we have not only a trading post but also a state-of-the-art museum. And the main exhibit area really talks about more contemporary issues that American Indians and specifically the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe are involved with. Our Four Seasons room a lot of time is talked about as being one of the best dioramas of any museums anywhere of American Indians, and which is a life-size diorama of how the Ojibwe lived a couple hundred years ago. And in that room we talk about cyclical living, kind of the cycles of the seasons, how the Ojibwe would sugar bush in the springtime, fish in the summer, harvest wild rice in the fall, and then make winter camp and trap and ice fish and different things like that. The Minnesota Historic Society has ran the site since 1960. Prior to that, it was a trading post that was run by Henry and Jeanette Ayers. When they actually donated the land, the buildings to the Minnesota Historic Society, they also donated a collection of 2,000 items that they had amassed over their time of running the trading post. So a lot of the items that you see in the museum are part of the Ayers collection, it's called. And a lot of those items date back turn of the century, so about 100 years old. The new museum was built, and which was opened in 1996. The Minnesota Historical Society worked very closely with the Mille Lacs Band members and the community, and so there was things specifically made just for the exhibits, like some of the dance outfits you'll see in the regalia in the Living Culture exhibit, for example. More recently, in the last, I would say 5–10 years, is cultural preservation has taken a priority among tribes, especially when you have the loss of language, when you have a lot of elders passing away that, you know, maybe are the last ones that make a certain item or knew how to do things a certain way. So I think that you're going to see more and more museums like this coming up on Indian reservations and in Indian country. The Mille Lacs Band moved into this area about mid-1700s. Prior to the Mille Lacs Band settling around Lake Mille Lacs, the Dakota called this their homeland. And the Ojibwe that settled here were actually part of a longer migration that came from the East Coast. And today you can find, you know, Ojibwe throughout Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, that type of thing. So Ojibwe are a very large tribe in North America. But the Mille Lacs Band has been here since the mid-1700s. You know, there's been struggles historically, one getting recognition of the reservation here. Another thing that, you know, was predominant in the 1990s was the hunting and fishing rights, a Supreme Court case that the Mille Lacs Band brought all the way to the Supreme Court and won to affirm their rights to fish. We get about 13,000 visitors a year here. It's interesting, we get people from all over the world, really. We have a world map up at the front door and we ask people to put pins where they come from, and we get people from 50 different countries each year. So the reaction is really positive. People really like coming to the museum, especially people if this is their first time coming through. We also offer workshops and special events. We have a powwow each year. We have an Indian art market. We do different crafts workshops so people can learn how to make moccasins or Ojibwe mittens, sweetgrass baskets, different things like that. And those are very well received too. People really enjoy doing those. One of the things I think that's important for all museums that talk about American Indian content is to highlight that it's a living culture, because a lot of times we want to place American Indians in the past, and so by the Four Seasons Room we talk about the past, we talk about a couple hundred years ago, and that's good for people to know, but it's also just as important that people know that we're still living these traditional ways. There's still people going out harvesting wild rice, there's still people tapping the maple trees to make syrup and sugar out of each year, netting, you know, that type of thing, so that these ways are still alive, you know, and a lot of times where these ways can really continue to live and even strive is on reservations, because you have that place where you have the cultural knowledge and you have the cultural resources to do those things to keep those ways alive.
Known as the Empire Builder, James J. Hill was instrumental in settling the Great Plains. Wielding the vision of a transcontinental railroad, Hill recruited immigrants to settle along his rail lines to create a market for his company. By the end of his life, Hill's economic dominance stretched from his headquarters in St. Paul all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
He's one of those examples of rags to riches story that Americans love so much. It wasn't typical of the great industrial leaders of the Gilded Age, of which he was certainly one. Most people who made it big started out pretty big, but he was born into poverty in frontier Ontario. He had no backing. He had basically an 8th grade education. As a teenager, really, he left Canada, tried his luck or bummed around some of the Gulf ports, New York and elsewhere, and settled on St. Paul, probably for the reasons that most people who paid any attention in the mid-19th century knew. St. Paul's the high point of navigation on the Mississippi River. Fast developing, lots of opportunities, so it made some sense to try your luck there, and he was fortunate enough to be hired on the levee initially to work as a clerk and perform other duties in St. Paul. So he kind of stuck with it, if you will. And of course, this part of the world started to grow economically very quickly afterwards. He was working really as a forwarding firm. Steamboats would come up the Mississippi and then they'd unload them, and then they'd transfer those goods, that merchandise, to stores, people, and so on. A good part of his first fortune, some of it is made in the steamboat trade, some of it is made in the coal trade. He's fairly prominent and certainly well off by the time he enters the railroad business at middle age.
Hill was a great user of circumstance. When a panic or financial troubles would occur, the opportunity presented itself for Hill to acquire interest in these other businesses, and eventually simply built up a portfolio that was so big that he essentially controlled the market in the northern part of the United States.
Really, railroading for James J. Hill was a second career. He became aware of the importance of railroad personally. Everybody read the newspapers, and certainly he did too. He knew railroads were important. The railroads, what I think of as the glamour industry of the 19th century. The best minds, most of the money, the best science, the best managers, the best workers, the best everything went into the railroads.
Hill was interesting in that he used his own fortune. The Great Northern was not a land-grant railroad, so he did not have the advantage that other railroads had in that they were able to leverage the land given to them by the government. The strength of his will and his business acumen and his personal fortune built the Great Northern.
In the 1890s, all the transcontinentals except the Great Northern went bankrupt in the Panic of 1893. Hill, backed by J.P. Morgan, will get de facto control of the Northern Pacific. They will purchase a controlling interest in the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. All of these lines together, plus some smaller lines, will form the basis of what's about to become the Northern Securities Company. The day Northern Securities is formed, it immediately becomes the largest single railroad organization in the country. So in the rise of big business, this is pretty big stuff. Only U.S. Steel is larger than Northern Securities, so it's a huge enterprise.
Hill was a force to be reckoned with. He firmly believed that this should all be one humongous entity, one railroad, and that was his dream, and it was the dream of empire. He was a very driven individual. He had a very large house in St. Paul on Summit Avenue, and I think he had that house simply to keep up appearances, because I don't know how often he stayed in that house, because he was busy moving around his system, busy making sure things were happening the way he wanted them to.
He was, I guess, in what we would call in the 21st century, a workaholic. 7 days a week, he was very much on the ground, hands-on, saw in person what happened. If you think of some of the other great railroad leaders of the time, they almost never inspected the railroad properties anywhere. Hill was constantly on the railroad, his railroad, and particularly as it expanded, first to construct it to make sure things were going well, and then the operation of it to make sure things were running smoothly. He was a micromanager, I suppose, in our terms today. He had this kind of restless temperament that he was constantly building more and always involved in things. In one sense, even though he retired formally from the railroad, first as president and then as chairman of the board, in some ways he probably never really retired.
In 1916, when he died, the entire system, all his holdings, all of the trains, all the ships, everything, at a preordained time came to a halt. The engine crews dismounted, the ships came to a stop, observed 5 minutes of silence in honor of Mr. Hill. After his death, the railroad named their premier train after him as the Empire Builder, and even today Amtrak preserves the name, the Empire Builder, for its passenger service across and on Great Northern's lines. So in effect, you can still ride Hill's dream even today.
This is the story of Chaska, a Dakota Indian who protected an imprisoned white woman for 6 weeks during the uprising of 1862. Years later, Chaska was wrongfully killed for murder another man committed.
We were prisoners of war. I thought I'd lost all I cared for. I was walking through hell without a way out, and you saved my life more times than I can count. I defended you then, and I'll do it again. I couldn't care less about the color of your skin. Your name should be known for your virtue to a woman, not one of your own. Chaska, my true friend, Chaska, man among men, you saved my life with no regard for a end. Then you were hanged by my people for being my friend, and in the end, you made my children safe in your teepee. You put yourself between the bullets and me. You sold your coat for our food. You gave me a horse when I couldn't walk from my wounds. You risked your life to keep us alive, but my people's rage wouldn't let you survive. We are alive because of you, and your reward was the white man's news. Chaska, my true friend, Chaska, man among men, you saved my life with no regard for your end. Then you were hanged by my people for being my friend, and in the end worse it went for you. The more I spoke of you, the less they believed. You refused to take my hand the last I saw you. You thought that I had done you wrong. The only pain in my heart near the pain of your death is that you thought I had a hand in it. Chaska, my true friend, Chaska, man among men, you saved my life with no regard for your end. Then you were hanged by my people for being my friend, and in the end.
Chris Cation is a professor of music at the University of St. Thomas and a world-renowned guitarist. He's made appearances on National Public Radio and Prairie Home Companion. Cation visited Prairie Public with fellow musician David Jenkins.
Hello, my name is Chris Cation, and I'm a guitarist from the Twin Cities. I'm a professor of guitar over at the University of St. Thomas, but I'm also a soloist in addition to being a teacher. I've been lucky enough to play on most of the continents of the planet. And today's program is interesting because none of it was originally written for guitar. Beethoven wrote nothing for guitar, but he did write a set of pieces for his intended paramour, who was a wonderful mandolinist. He wrote a set of pieces, 4 of them, for mandolin to be accompanied by piano. I play the mandolin part on the guitar, and What's so interesting about these pieces is that it's not music that one hears the guitar do. It's a kind of a Viennese romantic style that is not common for any kind of guitar music, though the guitar was so very popular in Vienna in the late 1700s. Particularly, however, this is Beethoven at his sort of pop music, folk music earliest roots. He is a young man in love, and he wrote some very melodramatic and histrionic and emotional pieces. Well, we know Beethoven is certainly interested in complex emotions. Here is Beethoven at his most callow and feckless, emotions on his sleeve compositional style. So the first one is very moody. The second, or the other Beethoven piece that we do, is really Beethoven channeling his neighbor, Franz Schubert. It's really a song, even though there were no words ever written. It was mandolin and piano once again. The way David Jenkins, my duet partner, and I conceive it is as a piece of Lieder, or in other words, in that grand tradition of German song composition.
If you know of an artist, a topic, or an organization in our region that you think would make for an interesting segment, please contact us at prairiemosaic@prairiepublic.org. I'm Bob Dambach.
And I'm Barb Gravel. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Prairie Mosaic.
Prairie Mosaic is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008, the North Dakota Council on the Arts, and by the members of Prairie Public.